Right, okay, folks. Here we go again. You know the score. So, just recently, might be the last episode from when this one goes out. Just done an interview with Vincent Felitti on the Adverse Childhood Experience study. Who I got in touch with Vincent after interviewing Johann Hari for his book Lost Connections, and Vincent was the star of Chapter 9 in that book. And so, I suppose in a bit of an attempt to carry on riding that gravy train of having interviewed a New York Times best-selling author, today we're going to be speaking to the star of Chapter 3. So, today we're going to be talking about death again. And so we've already covered this back in October when a couple of months after my dad died, we spoke to Julia Samuel, and that was episode 66, I think, if you want to go back and check that out. But I wanted to revisit the topic again because not only did I sort of come away from that conversation with loads more questions that I think they call it esprit d'escalier, where, you know, after the fact, it's like, oh, I should have asked this, I should have asked that. There was part of that conversation that we just sort of skimmed across, and that was dealing with the topic of the death of a child. And I don't think the experience that I had can be equated with that experience. I think arguably losing a child is a philosophically, qualitatively, psychologically a different experience. And because I've always said I wanted to confront the topic head on and fully, I don't think I'll have done that and kept that promise to myself if I didn't cover this topic of losing a child specifically. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So my guest today is Dr. Joanne Cacciatore. Have I pronounced that right?
Close enough. It sounds actually quite nice when you say it.
Oh, how am I supposed to say it?
Some people say Cacciatore, but I like Cacciatore.
Okay, I can.
I may introduce myself that way in the future.
Cacciatore.
So poetic.
Well, we'll go with that. Okay. Joanne is an associate professor at Arizona State University in the School of Social Work and a counsellor specialising in traumatic losses, most often the death of a child. She's the founder and president of the international non-profit organisation, the Miss Foundation, providing counselling, advocacy, research and education services to families experiencing the death of a child. She's also the founder of the Kindness Project, which encourages people to perform anonymous random acts of kindness in the community as a way of honouring the memory of their deceased children. And she's the co-founder of the Cellar Care Farm, the world's first ever care farm dealing exclusively with traumatic grief. She's a recipient of a number of awards, including the prestigious Hon Kachina Volunteer Award, the Sister Teresa Compassionate Care Award, and the Empathic Therapist of the Year Award, as well as having her research published in various peer-reviewed journals, such as The Lancet and the Omega Journal of Death and Dying. She's the author of a number of books, most notably Bearing the Unbearable, Love, Loss, and the Heartbreaking Path of Grief, which won the 2017 Indies Book of the Year Award in Self-Help and made it onto Oprah's basket of favourite things. So, Joanne, welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Danny, and for opening the door to discuss something that most people are running like hell from.
Yes, we're going to cover that as well. I saw you ran on Twitter the other day about this, so I definitely want to get into that. So, I always start these conversations by asking people how they got into whatever subject it is we happen to be discussing. But your story is probably a little different to most, a lot different to most. And so if you could take us sort of right back to the beginning before the academic career started and what... I was going to use the word inspired it. I don't know if that's an appropriate word, but I'll pass that over to you.
Sure. Yeah, let's see. Did it inspire? It more like grabbed me by the shoulders and dropped me, from a very, very, very high place. So I had 3 children in 1994, and I was pregnant with my fourth, and she died. And she was a baby, and they never found a cause of death. And after an autopsy, they had no explanation for why she died. She just died. And I was surrounded by, this is 1994, before social media, before the internet, and I was surrounded by a lot of people who didn't know what to do or say, except for the rhetoric around grief, like, oh, God needed an angel to tend his garden, which is absolute lunacy in my mind. Even if people believe in God, to think that God has a landscaping problem, goes around taking people's children to be on his crew, I mean, it's ridiculous, and it's minimizing. It's a platitude that no one really needs to hear. And I was flailing quite a bit. I had 3 young children to take care of, and I wasn't doing a very good job because no one was doing a very good job taking care of me. And so I lost a great deal of weight. I found myself in the longest, darkest night of my soul I would ever face. And I was trying to figure out, am I going to stick around for this? Am I going to be able to stick around? Am I going to live through this? And I made a promise one night on my closet floor. I didn't do a lot of sleeping in the first 6 or 7 months. And I made a promise to myself and a promise to my dead child that if I lived through it, that I would help other people who were going through the experience, so that they didn't have to be alone like I felt. And so I did. It was 3 years later I started the Miss Foundation, which is an international nonprofit, and we help families whose children are dying or have died at any age, from baby to a 45-year-old baby who dies. And we help those families learn how to cope, and we share in community with them. We remember, we cry with them, and we love them. That's what we do. We connect people who are hurting, who are suffering one of life's greatest losses. We connect them to each other so that they know they're not alone. And we became, really popular. And then before you knew it, we had more than 70 chapters around the world, and our website gets 1 million hits a month. And, we have a lot of activity going on in the world, and it's really beautiful, but it's also beauty that was born from the deepest, pain and agony and despair.
So I feel like I've got to be sort of careful asking hypotheticals, because obviously this isn't something I've experienced, but the nearest I can come to it is that when my little boy was about 2 years old, he went into hospital with suspected meningitis. And from all the sort of horror stories you hear from that, I remember just sort of spending the night in the hospital there, waiting for the news that that's what he had. And then, of course, pessimism would have sort of taken over, and of course he wasn't going to get better from it. And I remember sitting in the chair in that little waiting room and thinking, if anything happens to him, I am done. Like, I'm just done. And of course, I don't know if that would have been the case, but I felt very much like, if that would have happened to me, my life is over. But then, in a sort of weird, scary way, when my little girl came along, if anything happened to one of them, that wasn't an option anymore. You have to stick around for the other child if anything happened to one of them. And in a weird way, that sort of scares me, that I'd be trapped in life having to deal with the loss of a child. And I'm just wondering if, like, when you talked about the losing weight and sort of spiraling, was that accidental or was that purposeful? Because you talked about whether I'm going to make it through this. Was this something that was happening to you, or was you sort of doing it to yourself, in the sense that I maybe thought that I would have done to myself?
Yeah, it's an interesting thought experiment, right? So of course, retrospective analyses are always really quite interesting, as opposed to being in the moment. But looking back on who I was nearly a quarter of a century ago when my child died, one of the things that I know is that you don't actually survive it. Whether or not you have other children, and whether or not you physically survive, your sense of self, who you were before, does die. In fact, I had a bereaved father here just this morning before I jumped on the call with you, and he talked about dematerialization. He said, I'm dematerializing. And we talked about it more. And I said, did you start dematerializing the day she died, really? And he said, yeah, his daughter died. And he said, yes, I dematerialized the day she was died. And what I mean by that is you die as you were before. When you have such catastrophic loss, you're not the same person as you were. And there is a much necessary pulling in of that energy and being reduced in a sense to, to nothingness again. Because everything is called into question, everything, who you are as a person, as a partner, as a parent, as a human being, in what kind of a world do children die before their parents and their parents can't protect them? Everything just about the world changes. Everything we thought we knew about our spiritual practice changes. You just are not the same person, and you don't even view the world the same anymore. So it used to be before your child died, you were living in the world of the living and you were living to live. And then your child dies, and now you're not living in the world of living. You're almost in a different dimension. You see things that other people miss, and you perceive things that other people don't perceive. You're in what I call a liminal space between the world of the living and the world of the dead. And you don't really want to be here, and yet here you are. And you're really longing and pining to be with your child who died. It's quite a it really, I probably can't use expletives, can I?
Of course you can.
It's a mind fuck. I mean, it's a complete mind and heart fuck. You just can't figure out, why am I here? Why am I still here? And so in a very real sense, you are reduced to if you use the mythology of the phoenix, you're reduced to ashes. And then at some point, you start to very slowly rise up. We hope. I mean, grief is, you don't remain unchanged after catastrophic loss, Danny. You just don't. And so one of two things happens, because you can't remain unchanged. It's destructive, and it destroys the loss, and what we're usually not doing with the loss and being with the loss destroys us. Or it is productive in the sense that, not that it's supposed to happen or that there's a reason for it happening. I hate platitudes, but there's a deeper meaning that somehow slowly, and this is the key, because it happens so slowly, it's almost imperceptible. And then you start to see that you can remember your loved one who died, and that you can still grieve for that person, and that in grieving and in remembering, that comes a sort of unstoppable force of compassion that you can bring to the world because of that person. And it doesn't ever, this is the key, is that it doesn't ever make it okay. Like, it's still not okay. 25 years later, if I could give everything that I've learned and everything that I've given to others and everything that I've been gifted from others and every growth that I've experienced, if I could give it all back to have her in a heartbeat, I would. I don't get that choice. So the choice was to be a destroyed version of me, a smaller, more contracted, floundering version of me, or to somehow take that energy, because grief is energy, to somehow take that energy, live in it fully, go into the very center of the hardest, most frightening places in my heart, and allow it to transform me. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm thinking that there's a potential third way as well, which again I'd suspect that might happen to me, just based on what my personality is like anyway, is that rather than it sort of actively destroy me, and obviously people turn to addiction and drinking and destructive behaviors and things like that, mine would be a sort of, because I struggle with this anyway, a sort of just an overwhelming cynicism about the world. Just, I think, a sort of darkness would descend on the world for me, where I wouldn't take it upon myself to destroy myself, but I'd struggle to find inspiration in it. I'd just be like, yeah, this is just, like, say, I see it when you see, especially when you see things like, you get kids with cancer and stuff. And that's just enough for me sometimes. You just go, nah, it's not a good place, this. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And how, well, I suppose it'd be a two-part question, as well as just avoiding becoming self-destructive and avoiding that cynicism, because then you said you one day felt inspired, and so I'm just wondering, yeah, what was the genesis of that? Like, how did you avoid not becoming cynical, but not only that, to one day be inspired by it and say, no, I'm gonna do something with this? What was the impetus for that?
Well, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. So the sun and the moon exist in the same sky,
Right,
right?
yeah.
And so I am quite cynical, actually.
Okay.
And I'm also very deeply compassionate, and that I don't think of it as inspired. I think of it as meaning, not meaning in her death. For me, there's no meaning in her death. There's only the meaning that I can infuse in bringing her love to the world in a way that that she lives through me. And that doesn't mean it comes without cynicism, and that doesn't mean that it doesn't come without maybe some anger some days. Like, I shouldn't have to do this shit. Why should I have to do this shit? I don't want to do this. I didn't sign up for this, right? And I let myself feel those kinds of things. That's okay. I'm allowed to be cynical. I can be cynical and compassionate at the same time.
Is your cynicism that you possess now as a direct result of that experience, or were you sort of that way inclined anyway?
No, I don't think I was that way inclined anyway. I maybe a little bit. I mean, I stopped eating animals when I was 7 years old in 1972. You do the math. I'm old. And you know, if you're gonna stop eating animals and be sensitive to cruelty to animals in the world, then you damn well, Skippy, know cynicism. Right. And so I've always been sensitive. I was on the first Save the Whales campaign for Greenpeace many years ago. And so I think that there was a certain level of cynicism, but not anything like what you feel when your child is dead. I think, there still are many times I feel like, what's the use? And the thing is, that's okay. I'm allowed to ask those hard questions that don't have answers. What is the use? There's really not a good answer for me. Even 25 years later, there's not. And so I get to choose in any particular moment to feel my cynicism. And that's okay. And sometimes I withdraw my energy and say, I'm going to go for a barefoot hike, or I'm going to go sit with my horse and cry. Or I can say, I want to do something kind for someone today. And that's actually a decision that I make, knowing that, when I do it, I carry my dead child's love in the center of my mother heart. And that has some power for me. It's not to make the cynicism go away. It's to make room for something else. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. Yeah. Right. What I do now is I want to start. We'll jump into some of the research aspects of it, and some of your opinion, like professional opinions. And I'll just say, sort of, feel free to weave in and out of personal and professional experiences as you see sort of fit to answering the question. So I guess the first question is, so you specialize in traumatic death, especially that of a child, and a couple of questions sort of bunched up in there. I guess maybe there's what distinguish from a definition perspective, what distinguishes a traumatic death from a regular old death, let's say, and also expanding on this idea. I said at the beginning, I believe that losing a child is, philosophically and qualitatively different than my experience of losing my dad. And it's one of those things that you ask that question, what's different about losing a child? And it's like, well, of course it's different. But let's not just go with, of course. If you'd expand on why that is.
Sure. So let me tackle the first part of the question first. What's traumatic grief? So, and how does traumatic grief differ than non-traumatic grief? And I'll give you an example. During the course of my work with families, I was working with both bereaved mothers who had lost young sons. Well, one lost a really young son, one lost a teenager. And During the course of our work together, they were both very close to their grandmothers, and one of them, their grandmother, became very ill. She was in her late 80s, and she had cancer, and so she had hospice, end of life care, a wonderfully compassionate palliative care team. Pain control was well handled, and they knew death was imminent the day she died, the day grandma died. Everyone knew death was imminent. So all the family came together. They held hands around grandma. The lights were lit. They lit candles. They sang her favorite songs. They said goodbye. They were crying, and grandma's pain was controlled, and she died. And for all intents and purposes, the way the mother described this to me was, it was a beautiful, even if painful, death. The other mother I was working with, about the same time period, her grandmother also died, but someone had broken into her home, about the same age grandmother. Someone had broken into her home and murdered her.
Okay.
And that's the easiest way for people to understand traumatic grief versus non-traumatic grief. Even though we're talking about two grandmothers who are both in their mid to late 80s, one grief is not traumatic and one grief is. So in the literature, generally, we define traumatic grief as the death of a child, any age and any cause. So no one ever expects their child to die before them. So that's number one. Suicides and homicides are almost always considered traumatic, no matter the age of the person who dies, at least in the West. And then, any kind of untimely death, like if your partner is running a marathon and your partner's 40 and runs a marathon, twice or three times a year, and all of a sudden dies, because I've had this happen with clients, that would be traumatic, right? So that's how we generally define traumatic grief in the field. Now, the second part of your question, remind me what that was.
Well, that's when you make the statement that losing a child is obviously worse than losing a parent or a partner, it's like, okay, well, why obviously? Because it's kind of taken for granted.
Yeah, it's different for most people. And so one of the things is sort of in our minds what we expect from the world, right? Sort of our expectations of the world. And in the 21st century in the West, we generally don't expect to outlive our children. From just an evolutionary or biological perspective, it seems contrary, doesn't it?
Yeah, of course it does,
yeah. That in a sense, a parent would outlive a child. And so I think it's different from a sort of expectation view. I think it's different from an evolutionary view. I think it's different in the sense that this is a young person a baby or a young child or a teenager or a young adult who didn't get to live his or her full life. And so there's so many things that you miss when your young child dies, or when your 40-year-old child dies even. I mean, I work with a woman and she was in her 80s and her 45-year-old baby died. And their plan was for her daughter to take care of her when she was dying. And so now she's dying without her daughter. And so, because her daughter died before her. And so all of the ways that we envision that the world will be have been shattered. There's a writer, a researcher in the field, her name is Janet Bowman, and she talks about shattered world assumptions. And there are so many shattered world assumptions when your child dies. The world just doesn't feel safe anymore. It's such a contradiction of what should be. And it's painful to lose your partner as well. And it's really painful to lose your parent, right? Even though your parent will probably die before you, it's painful when it happens, right? And so I'm not, this isn't minimizing other people who have other experiences of loss, but it is addressing sort of the question of what makes the death of a child different.
Yeah, I think there's something about that. Children they contain the ultimate potential, which is, there's something about that concept of potential that's particularly sort of, I don't know, sort of inspiring. It's one of the things about the human experience which sort of makes it worthwhile, and the innocence aspect as well. The idea that could ever happen to a pure being. That's what I imagine is sort of particularly upsetting as well. And that, obviously that's just from an abstract standpoint. That's not even necessarily being related to the child and having carried the child, which, yeah, I can't even imagine.
Yeah.
So
I'm going to add one more thing to that. Also, parents seem to have this belief system that, that their love can protect them and that they should be omniscient around their children. And so when a child dies, there can be, for many parents, a tremendous sense of guilt and responsibility that is not always present with other deaths, that can sometimes be so encumbering that it can be very difficult to find equilibrium in the world again.
Yeah, we're going to get onto that actually. In fact, let's do that now since we'll segue into it. So one thing I'm interested in, and a lot of these questions are in line with some of the research you've done. I've done my research on you, Joanne. So one of the things I'm sort of interested about in the ways that losing a child tends to affect the couples, and whether when that happens, are people more likely to end up divorced as a result of that, and how it tends to affect the mother and the father differently. I'll come to the blame thing. I think that's tied in, but if we just start with that, the sort of the immediate effects and the different experiences for the mother and the father.
Sure. So of course we're categorizing people, which I'm not a big fan of doing, but we do see that this definitely causes some distress in couples. And I think one of the reasons is because it causes distress inside of us. And so when we're having trouble even staying in our own bodies, because there's so much trauma in it, it's very hard to stay in relationship to others. And that goes for the dyad, the couple dyad, whether it's a mother and father or two moms or two dads, or whether it's mom to living children, or dad to living children, or living children to each other. So, this causes a lot of stress in the family system, generally speaking, because it causes a lot of stress and distress and traumatic stress within us, within our bodies and our minds and our souls, or existential self. And so you get people who are in the beginning oftentimes sort of, like a symphony, and everybody's sort of in tune with each other because they've all been sort of struck by the same lightning blow, right? The same thing has struck everyone. And so everyone's just sort of collapsed under the weight of trauma, the initial trauma. And then as people try to find their way and find their path and find, how am I going to cope with this? You have the disparate coping, right? And so you have one person coping in a way where this person A needs to go to the cemetery every day and cry every day and recapitulate the story over and over and over and review every single little detail and read the autopsy report and go back to the place where it happened and talk about it all the time. And then you have person B, who might be focused more on tasks and not able to stay with the details of it right now. And so that person is perhaps a little bit more avoidant and doesn't want to go to the cemetery every day and doesn't want to recapitulate the details. And so you can see there's a problem going to develop there, right? Because one person wants to and person doesn't. And the way person A interprets person B's response is, you don't care. And the way person B interprets person A's response is, you're trying to control me and tell me how to grieve. And so there can be a lot of interpersonal conflict around this. And this is why, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I was, the main thing I was wondering about is, like we were just talking about, is the idea of blame. And I should probably have added as well, a lot of the research that you've done is specifically around stillbirth. So so this specifically as it comes to blame, because obviously it'd be different if you're talking about, like, I don't even like saying this shit out loud, but like a child with leukemia or something like that, interpersonal blame in the couple isn't going to happen. But so like in your circumstance, so yours was a stillbirth, And you mentioned in Lost Connections that after the autopsy, that they couldn't find any congenital defects, and so you blamed yourself. You thought it was your body that during the labour that had essentially suffocated your daughter, and with that kind of thing, especially between couples, I'm wondering how often that maybe becomes a thing where, I mean, I can imagine it's common for the mother to blame herself, but for maybe the partner to blame the mother as well, and things coming up like, well, maybe if you'd have done this differently, if you hadn't have been eating, such and such a thing, or you'd have taken a bit better care of yourself, and that sort of thing. I'm wondering how often that happens.
Okay, so a couple of things. Yes, my daughter actually died during childbirth on her due date. And so, yes, I blamed myself. I really turned that inward. Her father never blamed me, but I have heard blame. But I also want to challenge that just a little bit and tell you that I also hear blame between partners no matter how the child dies and no matter what age, believe it or not. So I work with a father, for example, who gave his 16-year-old daughter the keys to the car and sent her to the store to pick up something a mile down the road, and she was hit by someone who ran a red light and she died. And there were family members who blamed him for giving her it doesn't have to be rational,
right?
Because that's the thing. It doesn't necessarily have to make sense, and it doesn't have to be anyone's fault. It's just people are flailing trying to understand, how could this tragedy happen? I have had parents with children who are terminally ill, and one parent promised the other parent, our child is going to be okay. He's going to be okay. I promise. Trust me, it's going to be okay. And then the child dies. And then the parent feels betrayed by the other parent who promised it would be okay. This is not uncommon. And I hear it in stories from people all the time. And I think this is something that's really important. I'm so glad you're talking about it, because if we don't talk about it, we don't know how normal it is, and we can't then work through these issues.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of tangentially related, I guess. I remember when, people will be sort of familiar with my story, regular listeners, but two things here. So I used to own a business and I was doing quite well with it, and then ended up going bankrupt. And at the same time, my dad was he'd been diagnosed with a form of muscular dystrophy, which is essentially a death sentence. It just depends, when it's gonna happen. And it was a form of muscular dystrophy called myotonic dystrophy, where there's nothing, there's no medication, there's no treatment, there's nothing you can do about it. But after I went bankrupt, and my dad started getting sicker and sicker, I started to blame myself, because I got this daft idea in my head that if I'd have just carried on with my business and done well, I'd have been able to find a doctor somewhere, especially like in America. I could have found that doctor in America, that one doctor, that special doctor who knew what to do and knew how to fix him, and that it was my fault that this was happening to him. And it's so weird that, and I still struggle with that one a little bit. Like, I could have made his life a bit better if it hadn't have been for me. And it's interesting how we do that to ourselves. Like you say, that completely irrational blame that we set upon ourselves.
Right. Exactly what you're talking about is what I just explained to you. I mean, it's common. It happens all the time. And it's important to give people a place to talk about it, even though it's not rational,
Okay, so one question as it relates to, like we've just spoke about, how it might affect the family dynamic. And this is one of the questions I completely forgot in the last conversation talking about this, was how to explain death and dealing with the grieving process of maybe children you've already got, of siblings of the child that's been lost. Because I know you wrote a couple of books on this. One is What Colour is Death, Daddy? Which, interesting title as well, if you wouldn't mind explaining that. And the other one was Kaleidoscope of Grief, which I believe were both aimed at children. And so, just because it was something that just explaining that my dad had died to my little boy, my little girl's too young. I didn't know how to handle that. I didn't quite know what to do with it, whether you're going to damage them or anything like that. So, yeah, what's the deal with that?
Yeah. Well, I mean, explaining death to children is, it's tied into explaining grief to children, but it's also different because death is something that happens, right? Somebody dies, somebody you love deeply dies. And so generally in what we call death notification with children, it's best to keep it short and simple and direct and honest. And that can be really hard for adults. Children actually tend to handle things so much better than adults. We get wrapped up in our own minds of how we're going to screw them up for the rest of their lives by telling them this, and they seem to handle it quite with a lot of grace and young wisdom, if you will. So generally I tell people, keep it direct, keep it short, simple, but direct, and answer questions. And so they may bring up a question today and then ask them tomorrow again, do you have, let's say grandpa died. So do you have any questions today about what's happening with grandpa being dead, or with grandpa passing away, whatever is comfortable language for the family. And answering those questions. So what does it mean grandpa died? Well, grandpa's not breathing anymore. His heart stopped beating. And then his body will decompose. We'll bury him. We'll cremate him, and then we feel sadness because we'll miss him. And that's where you get into talking about the grief, right? And this is important because what we tend to do with children is not understand that children do grieve, but they grieve in their own way. Usually it's incrementally, and where they'll cry and they'll be sad, and then they'll pop their head up and go, can I go play? And then they go outside and play, and people think, okay, they're done, but they're not, right? And so we need to understand that children don't grieve like adults do all the time, and it's not very easy for them to articulate, so it may come out behaviorally. Their grief may come out in their behaviors, and giving them a safe place to talk about feeling sad. What is sadness? Disney made that one movie about emotions, and I saw that movie. I can't remember what it's called. No, Pixar made it. Sorry, Disney. Sorry, Pixar. And it was about emotions, and it was, like all emotion. Really quite an emotionally intelligent movie. We have to teach children that they can feel sadness, and that we don't have to replace their dog who died with another dog tomorrow so they feel better, right? Just let them feel sad. They're allowed to feel sad. It's one of the greatest disservices we do to children is not letting them feel sad. I know it hurts us as adults, and I know we want to fix them, but there are some things we cannot fix. And we need, and as adults, that's a valuable lesson for them to understand. There are going to be some things in life that cannot be replaced and fixed. You cannot replace your dad. You have one dad. You love your dad. You miss your dad. That's okay. And when we abbreviate it and try to shortcut it, we actually cause ourselves more suffering in the long run.
Yeah. What was the inspiration for that title, Joanne?
Oh, What Color is Death?
Yeah.
Because I always thought of my grief. No, I always thought of me as a human being as a box of crayons. You know how sometimes you take your children to a restaurant and they give them 4 crayons?
Yeah.
Red, orange, green, blue. Oh, I never wanted that. That was rather boring to me. I wanted to be the big box of crayons, right? And the big box of crayons represents a lot of emotions, right? And so the color of death, in a sense, looking at the darkness, the dark crayons in your box, or the not so pretty colors, the colors that people don't automatically grab the first time, as opposed to the vibrant red, maybe the kind of dirty green or black or the dark colors, and helping children understand that all of those colors have a value. That even if we look at our grief and the death of our loved one, and it feels like an ugly color of black or brown or green, or a beige color that's yellowish or looks like mustard, or a color that we just don't prefer. to the bright reds or the bright greens or the bright yellows. Those colors have value. We need those colors too, because if we don't have those colors, then we don't get the full experience of the bright red. The bright red looks brighter when it's next to the dull green.
Yeah, no, I like that. Then my next question is, it's going to sound a bit judgy, this, I guess.
Not like I haven't heard plenty of judgy things.
Well, it's not intentionally. I'm just, it's my honest opinion, Joanne. It's this idea of, and again, it's because I know you've done research on this. It's after a baby's stillborn, some couples will they'll dress the child and hold the child, and also there's something called memento mori photography, where they take pictures of the child. And the first one, the idea of holding the child, I'm trying to think of this happening to me, and what you imagine is never the same as reality. And I imagine that I'd be slightly, I don't know how I'd feel about it. I feel like I'd be uncomfortable with it. But then the pictures, and you sometimes have seen people post them online on Facebook and stuff, and it strikes me as a bit weird. I don't get it. So especially sometimes I've seen pictures of babies that are clearly, even though they've been made up and stuff, they look harrowed, and you can still see like bruises on the face, and I feel that's sometimes a bit disrespectful, maybe. And like I say, I feel horrible saying that out loud. But you've actually researched this and the positive effects of doing that, and so I just sort of hand that over to you, and feel free to chide me for that if that's, I'm coming out from
I won't have to chide you, because if you allow comments on this video, plenty of parents are going to chide you. So, so the thing is, Danny, this is all they have.
Right.
They don't get, and this is one of the things that makes the death of a very young baby excruciatingly painful, is that they don't get a picture of their baby bright-eyed with a big smile that everyone looks at and wants to see and says, oh, look how beautiful, how hard for you. All they get is this picture. And it's an important picture. I will tell you that I have worked with women. I had a woman not long ago out to the care farm who had a baby die in 1956. 1956. Mm-hmm. She never held her baby. She didn't touch her baby. She has no photos of her baby. And she spent all of the year since 1956 until very recently in very self-destructive behaviors, because she could not make that child real in her heart. And that's not her fault. That is the fault of a society that sent her messages. You have no right to mourn for this child. We're going to because what happened back then is you had a baby, and if the baby died during birth or just after birth, they'd put you to sleep. Of course, it was sleepy time for most women who had babies back in the 50s and 60s. So they put you to sleep, and the baby dies right after birth or during birth. They called it, there was a researcher who called it the rugby pass management of baby death. And the baby was passed from the doctor to the nurse to someone waiting in the hall, taken out to the morgue, cremated. Meanwhile, family members went to the house, disassembled the nursery, and then everyone pretended the baby never existed. You think how good, how psychologically healthy do you think that was for entire generations of women? It wasn't.
Yeah.
It wasn't. It makes people inclined to participate in what we call mother's little helper.
Yeah, I mean, well, just to be clear, I'm not saying it's something that I don't think people should do. It's just, I guess it's something that I sort of struggle.
It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it's something I struggle to understand.
Yeah. Well, and here, let me help you to understand it a little bit. You want any kind of visage, tangible memory that you can have to remind you of this person who has made, who, though maybe here far too briefly, has made such an impact on your world and will for probably the rest of your life. So, I mean, I imagine being an old woman somewhere not too many years from now, and you know, and telling people, you know, about my children and my grandchildren, and she will be included in that.
Yeah.
And I have evidence of that because I have a lock of her hair and I have pictures with her, even though they're grievous pictures. And even though they're pictures that I don't share with everyone because not everyone can handle it. It's still my 8-pound, 22-inch long, beautiful baby girl, number 4, who will always be number 4. And I have these memories with her that I cherish. If I had the choice to have pictures of her alive, I promise you I would have rather, but I didn't get that choice. And so it's the best that they have, given the tragedy of the circumstances.
Yeah, well, I can certainly vouch for that. You know, it might sound a bit weird to say that, you know, someone can have such a massive impact on you that didn't survive very long, but especially when the pregnancy's seen through to full term. You know, I've been through 2 of those pregnancies, and unless you're a parent, I remember when I wasn't a parent and people used to preface a sentence like this, and you'd be like, "Oh, shut up." But unless you're a parent, you don't get it, and you know, those the first time seeing the belly sort of vibrate a little bit, and then there's kicking and rolling going on, and you talk to it, and you get the ultrasounds and stuff, and that is, you know, that's an experience, that's an entire sort of interaction and relationship going on, even if you know, even if you never actually get to sort of meet that person face to face, so to speak.
Yes.
Okay, so where to go now with this? I don't want to jump around too much. Okay, this one, and I know you'll have opinions on. So this is, I'm interested in your opinion of the DSM-5 and its and its classification changes related to grief. Well, I'll hand that over to you to explain exactly what I mean by that, and
Okay.
And then I might play devil's advocate a little bit. I might struggle because I'm fully on board with your opinions on this, but take it away.
Yeah, I do have some rather strong opinions. The boils down to that it's fucking bullshit first, but in a more scholarly sense. So the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual has been called the Bible of psychiatry. And we're on the 5th iteration now, which I believe came out in March of 2013. The 3rd iteration of the book, many years ago, probably I think the 70s, maybe earlier. Sorry, maybe earlier. That might have been the 4th. So this was all pre-university study for me. The DSM-3 basically said major depressive disorder is a thing, clinical depression, capital D depression, is a thing. And they also realized that clinical depression, capital D depression, looked a lot like grief. So how do we protect people who are grieving from being diagnosed with clinical depression? And they came up with something called the bereavement exclusion. And the bereavement exclusion basically said, if you have these symptoms, you have clinical depression unless, and accepting one circumstance, and the circumstance was that you had a family member who died in the last year, or a loved one who died in the last year. So basically you had a year to have the symptoms of grief, and then you could be diagnosed with clinical depression at the end of a year. Well, the DSM-4 came along, and I think the 4 was actually in the 70s, and they changed the guidelines. The bereavement exclusion was changed. And so it said, you know, you have clinical depression if you have these things, you know, but even the most skilled clinician really can't tell the difference between capital D depression and grief. I mean, the overlaps are ridiculous. I mean, it's absurd, especially traumatic grief. So the DSM-4 closed that gap and basically said you have 2 months now. Instead of 1 year, they said you could have the grief symptoms for 2 months, and if at the end of 8 weeks you still have these symptoms, you can be diagnosed with a mental disorder, which is capital D depression. Well, the DSM-5, so now I'm on the scene and doing my work. And the DSM-5 comes out with this crazy bullshit where they're going to take the bereavement exclusion out entirely, despite really poor outcomes in field tests on in the reliability of diagnosing capital D depression. And they're going to basically give clinicians the right to use their judgment in determining whether someone has capital D depression. And you could be diagnosed as early as 2 weeks after the death of someone you love. 2 weeks after the catastrophic death of someone you deeply love, you could be diagnosed with a mental disorder if you're still having what is absolutely normal, accepted, evolutionarily programmed symptoms of grief. It's just bizarre.
So one of the pushbacks against this change that I read from quite a few people that were in favour of it was that, you know, everyone that's against this, you're just being hysterical because it's just a guideline. Calm down, and whether or not this is actually going to be put into practice by clinicians, very rarely are clinicians gonna actually, you know, get to 2 weeks and then say, right, you know, you're clinically depressed now. Do we know how that's actually played out?
Yes, we have seen an increase in diagnoses. And let me tell you about a study that I did just before the DSM-5 came out. So based on the guidelines of the DSM-4, you were supposed to have 2 months. 2 months. They were diagnosing and giving medication for depression even within that 2 month period of time to bereaved parents. And one of the studies that I did with Jeff Lacasse at the University of Florida State University, we found that almost 4 out of 10 bereaved mothers were prescribed medication, the majority within 48 hours after their child died. If that's happening based on the DSM-4 guidelines, I can guarantee you it's happening in the DSM-5 guidelines too. We're going the wrong direction. What we should have done is gone back to the 1 year. Well, actually, what we should do is just throw the whole damn thing out.
Okay, what about the idea that in detecting these things, that there's nothing qualitatively different between depression as a result of grief and clinical depression, and especially when you say, you know, if what people sometimes call reactive depression, so you're depressed because you've just been cheated on, or a divorce, or lost your job or something, and then grief, you know, what makes grief so special?
Well, what makes grief so special is it's the irreparable death of someone you love very, very deeply, right? So if I lose my job, I probably can get another job. As hard as that might be, and as sad as I may be about my job, there's a chance at redemption. You know, your 8-year-old dies of cancer. There's no redemption. There's no 8-year-old's going to replace your 8-year-old who died, right? We all know this. This isn't rocket science. All we need to do is think about it for a minute, really, with an open heart. Like I lose my home and it's a terrible thing, and nope. In fact, this is within my personal life. This was my 25 years after my child died. It's given me the great gift of perspective that I'd like to give back. And the perspective is this: something terrible happened. Did anyone die? No. Okay, we're fine. We can deal with it.
So you mentioned but I'm genuinely surprised by that. And you know what, though, Joanne, I never cease to be surprised by some of the shit that I hear going on out there in the world of clinical psychology, especially as it relates to the DSM. But I suppose that a question would be, is it ever appropriate to bring medication into the equation? What's your experience been with that?
No, for me, no. The answer to that is no. And this is why it's no. Because usually when someone comes to me and they're very, let's call it dysregulated, they're having a lot of fear, which they call panic attacks, which is just fear. Let's call it what it is. It's fear. Why wouldn't you be afraid? Okay. In a world where your child can die or be murdered, or someone, or your child end his or her own life or die during birth. In a world like that, who wouldn't be afraid of a world like that? Okay, so let's take fear, for example. If someone's having a lot of fear, or they're having a lot of dysregulated emotions, or they're having trouble concentrating at work, or they're feeling very lonely and very isolated, and so they're socially withdrawing, and they feel like they're not coping well, one of the very first questions I ask people is, how are people treating you and your grief?
Okay.
And I would say 999 times out of 1,000, they're not getting the kind of support they need. And I'm not talking about clinical support. I'm talking about faith community support, family support. I'm talking about neighbor support. I'm talking about social support, broadly speaking. And why is this, and how do we know that this is true? There are a number of research studies. One a researcher by the name of Vanessa Juth, who has studied many times the experience of what she calls social constraints on the bereaved. And what she found was that social constraints precipitate what she calls negative long-term outcomes and poor adjustment in bereavement, negative long-term outcomes, including physical health problems. So in other words, the social system, people saying, stop talking about it. Aren't you over it yet? Just have another one. Just let it go. Just choose happiness. Gag me. All of those social constraints to the bereaved actually put a type of pressure on them to conform to what I call the happiness cult. They internalize those messages, and then they really can't cope, because what they really feel inside is so incongruent with what they're trying to be on the outside for the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And so that causes sort of a disconnection. Now they have to pretend constantly, which requires a lot of energy to hold up that artifice, right? And they have to go out in the world and pretend like they're okay, or they'd be judged.
Well, that brings up this is a sort of cliched statement that might be true, that we don't handle death properly here in the West. You look to the East and look to other cultures, and they do death better than us. And is that true? And if so, what are they doing better than us? And who would we maybe look to sort of the ideal way to deal with it?
Yeah, I can't actually answer that for sure, because in every culture I've ever studied, I have people who say kind of the same thing. And it's not really even about handling death. I mean, there are death cafes now. People talk about death now. It's almost cool to have skulls around. It's less palatable to talk about grief than it is to talk about death. We're much more comfortable talking about death than about grief.
Go on, expand on that.
Well, again, our death cafes, but nobody wants to talk about like what happens in the aftermath, like facing your own death, or facing the death of an elderly parent, or even facing the death of a child, which is excruciating. Even parents I meet whose children die of a terminal illness tell me, well, I thought I was prepared, like I read all these books on dying, and I thought I was like prepared, and then my child died, and my entire support system disappeared, and hospice stopped following up with me at 6 months, and nobody wants to talk to me about his death. I mean, I work with a bereaved mother whose beautiful little boy died of cancer, and she's at a hospice, and no one came in and said, he's actually dying. What can we do for your grief right now? She didn't know even, and then he died, and when she left, the hospice staff waved to her and said, "Have a great summer."
So why?
Right, it's bizarre.
Why as a society then is that the attitude? Because like, you see, that's a distinction I've not really thought of before. The distinction between death and grieving, and I've sort of talked about the idea of people shun the elderly, and the elderly get cast aside because they force us to face our own mortality, and people sort of shirk talking about death for the same reasons. But why as a society is the grieving process taboo then?
Yeah, I think that grief is actually more shunned. And I think the reason why is because of our happiness cult. I mean, I don't know why, but we seem to think that we are entitled to be happy all the time in the West. We seem to think that if you're not happy, there's something wrong with you and you need to be happy. And it's like this, really, I mean, it's ensconced in the Constitution in the United States, right? The pursuit of happiness, right? It's, well, in the articles, right? It's the pursuit of happiness, that we want to protect people's right to pursue happiness, which is absolutely ridiculous. Happiness will never be more elusive as it is if we pursue it. And so in the pursuit of happiness, we have decried and devalued the very essence of our humanity, which is our suffering, our grief, right? And so when we see someone who's grieving, you know, we encounter a friend who's grieving, and I hear this all the time from grieving people, let's go get a drink. Oh, you're sad, let's go get a drink. Let's go have a drink. And it's like, oh my God. And then we castigate people who become alcoholics. What are we doing? You know, instead of sitting on the ground with your friend in the corner of the closet and holding her or him while he or she cries and weeps, and instead of remembering our dead and saying, yes, this is a deeply grievous time, even if whether it's been a month or whether it's been 10 years, because this kind of grief after catastrophic loss doesn't just resolve itself after 10 years or 5 years. You grieve for the rest of your life. And so we want to cheer people up. We want to make them better. I have people all the time who mistakenly introduce me to someone as, oh, she's a healer. And I'm like, don't say that. First of all, I'm not. And second of all, that's too much damn responsibility. Thank you. I am not a healer. I do not help people feel better. I help people feel. That's it. And ironically, the pursuit of happiness, it's such a paradox. The more we pursue it, the more unhappy we become. But when we learn to make space for our grief, for our pain, for our anger, for our suffering, for our longing for them, for the physical craving for their bodies, when we can stay with that, the irony of that is that it expands our lives to feel other things too. And so rather than becoming smaller and more contracted versions of ourselves, we become more expansive versions of ourselves. I am a deeply sorrowful person who probably cries at least every other day, sometimes once a day. And I am really, really fucking intensely joyful too.
Just to sort of hammer this point home, and I think it's worth mentioning, especially because I do actually get a lot of like students and academics that listen to this podcast. Again, just to hammer that point home, if you wouldn't mind just sharing this story about the journal refusing to publish some of your research recently and their reasons for saying so.
Oh, well, I don't have the verbiage in front of me, but I can tell you the spirit of what they said. So I conducted a research study with my doctoral student, Kara Thielman, brilliant doc student. Very fortunate to have her. And we finally finished the study. We collected a pretty large sample in Romania of traumatically bereaved parents. And, and their experiences within the cultural context, because context matters. And so in the context of Romania, what is it like to be a parent whose child has died? And so I submitted it to a journal for trauma. And the editor actually didn't even send it out for review. So she made a decision on her own and basically said, no, that this would be too traumatizing, that they would have an ethical dilemma because it would be too traumatizing for their readers.
And so this is a journal specifically related to death.
It's an academic journal. I mean, this isn't even it's not a magazine for lay people. This is for scholars and clinicians who work with people who are traumatized. And I am like, wow. I mean, we were just both, my doc student and I we were just like, you've got to be kidding me. I mean, it's just baffling to me.
Do you think that is more likely to be a case of, one editor being a bit too sort of a bit too much of a snowflake, too politically correct, or do you think this is, like you say, this happiness cult and this refusal to deal with trauma? It's really becoming systemic to that extent.
I don't think so. I think you're right. I think it was sort of a one-off, if you will. I don't think that's not normal, because I have 66 or 67 publications out there. So I don't, and it did get accepted. The second journal to where I submitted it accepted it. So I do think that it was, I think I was just taken aback by, yes, there were probably more qualitative responses that were descriptive than I have seen, because many of these parents had never been asked about their experiences. And so this was the place and time for them to really express. And I wasn't going to sugarcoat that. We weren't going to edit the really hard things to hear, because they deserve to be heard. They deserve to be witnessed by the academic community, who needs to know how traumatic it is in Romania to lose a child to death. And I wasn't going to edit that out. And so I think that probably it was one editor who felt it was difficult to listen to those stories and to read those stories, and who didn't want to probably approach it. I don't think that's a systemic issue yet. Let's hope.
Okay. So I don't know if there's a presupposition in this question that renders it invalid, but I'm wondering if there's anything to be said about whether somebody's the socioeconomic status or somebody's personality type that maybe makes them more adequately or less well equipped to deal with grief.
Mm-hmm. So I think you're talking about risk factors, okay? So, or protective factors on the other side. Some of the things that we know from research, education helps. It's a little protective, right? And this makes sense, because if you're educated, you probably have more access to resources. You know where to go to seek help. We know that socioeconomic status can be protective. So a higher income, of course, you can probably pay for better services, right? And being impoverished is a risk factor. We know that spiritual practice, that a belief in an afterlife, can be protective. And, and that people who don't have a belief in an afterlife might not have the same, might not derive the same kind of comfort that a spiritual person might from contemplating afterlife. So, yeah.
Is it true that, as related to like socioeconomic status, is it true that stillbirth is something that you can't predict it, and more often than not, we don't know why it happens? So something like being higher on the socioeconomic scale, even though you're going to be able to sort of better access services after the fact, you're still not necessarily protected from a stillbirth happening in the first place. Is that true, or have I got that mixed up?
So are you asking about ideologically, or are you asking about in the aftermath of loss? I'm a little bit confused. In the aftermath of loss, socioeconomic status does matter. In terms of prevention, you do see a slight increased risk in certain ethnic groups. I can't recall what the latest research says about etiological causes or epidemiologically what what the risk factors would be based on income. We do know that certain groups are more susceptible to the death of a baby, and that's not just stillbirth, but that's all perinatal. So including premature birth. You're not protected. Death can't be bought. And so you're not protected against certainly good health care helps, no doubt. But it doesn't guarantee anything.
Yeah, it scares the shit out of me, that. I've got to be honest. We're thinking about having another one, and I just sort of read that somewhere the other day that, I don't know, I thought it was something that was almost entirely preventable in the West, in the first world, and learning that that's not the case, and that it's often, it can be unpredictable and unexplained. Yeah, not very reassuring.
About half the time.
Okay, so I'm interested in getting on to the practical aspects of actually dealing with grief now. And there's a couple that are of particular interest. One is the idea of ritual in remembrance, and then the other is with what you're doing with this. Is it called the Cellar Care Farm?
Cellar Care Farm, yeah.
And green mental health. So let's start with this, because I know you've spoken on this before. The importance of ritual. So in remembrance and in grieving. So what are some helpful rituals, and are these something? Is it something you can manufacture in that sense? In that, if you do something like this can help, or is ritual more related to, like we were talking about, people that have maybe got that are religious and have got more of a spiritual side, that maybe their rituals come about spontaneously?
Yeah. Okay. So rituals. So I've done a lot of research actually on rituals and the value of rituals, and they're not, the way that I look at rituals is that they're not supposed to help grief necessarily.
Okay.
They're supposed to help us be with grief. They're supposed to help us go right into the center and externalize some of the internal emotions that we feel.
Sorry, Joanne. Let me just stress that point in case anyone's missing it, because I think I've missed it already a couple of times. There's a really important distinction to be made in your message here, whereas I keep inadvertently referring back to this idea of getting rid of grief, curing it, brushing it off, and you're saying that that's not what we're talking about.
That's right.
And so I just wanted to, in case, like I say, it's getting past me, so in case anyone else is missing it, that's where the emphasis is for you.
Yes, the emphasis for me is what I call fully inhabited grief, right? Fully living in the grief, and ironically, that's what brings us to a place of what I call true happiness, which is contentment. Really, true happiness is to be content with what is, in other words, what we feel, rather than having to change it, who we are rather than having to change it. I don't think people ever get to the point, or rarely people get to the point where they are okay that their child died. I mean, I'm not. And most of the families with whom I meet say that they're not okay that their child died. But we have to be, at some point, the invitation for us is to feel acceptance of what we feel. Not acceptance of that they died, but what we feel. And what we feel is grief. And so the idea of accepting the grief for what it is, and that ritual gives us a way to embody the grief and then to transform it into something outwardly. And so ritual usually starts for many people who lose a child or a parent or a partner or a friend even. Usually at the hospital will help facilitate that. And so some of the training that I do for hospital staff is how to facilitate meaningful ritual, because if someone just died at a hospital, this is the last time that person's physical body is going to look like this again, because at the funeral home, things aren't quite the same. And so if you don't have an opportunity to say farewell to the person in this form, you're not giving the family what I think they deserve, which is some time to say farewell to this body in this way, in this moment. And so facilitating sort of respectful ritual, and it has to be culturally appropriate too, because there are some cultures that don't allow touching of a body of a person after he or she has died. So it has to be culturally appropriate. I work with many Native people, and in some Native tribes, there is no touching of a dead body, and that's fine. There are other rituals in which we can engage. And so sometimes it means holding their child who died or other person who died. Sometimes it means crawling up in the bed at the hospital with them and laying with them. Sometimes it means taking a lock of hair or taking a mold of their hand or foot or both. It's whatever is meaningful in that moment to capture this moment, even though it's painful. It's hard to do, and it's certainly hard to think about it for most people. Most people have a hard time contemplating this, sort of on their own. Most people have a hard time getting through it because they're in such trauma and shock that they need the staff at the hospital to guide them. They need the social worker to come in and say, would it be all right with you if we took some photographs of you with your dad, kissing your dad on the forehead, or you holding your dad's hand? Those painful moments are also deeply meaningful to people. And sometimes they put them in an envelope, in a box, and look at them every 5 years, but it's that they have them. So it's creating any kind of farewell rituals at the hospital, and then you move on to the funeral home and letting people know, for example, if their child has died. Some states allow home funerals. And there are some parents I know who have opted for home funerals. And there is some research to suggest that parents who opt for home funerals have better psychological adjustment in the long term. I did not. I would have, if I would have been offered to me, I would have, but no one told me it was an option. And so home funerals are one way that people can enact their own meaningful, culturally sensitive rituals around death. And farewells. And so what parents oftentimes aren't told in the funeral home is that they can often pick up their child and hold their child if they want, that they don't, not always, but often, that they can at least touch and see and hold their child at the funeral home, that they can take a lock of hair, that they can stay there for as long as they want. Most funeral homes are pretty sensitive to parents' needs. And if a parent called and said, I need to come and stay with my child's body for a while. I mean, when my daughter died, I went to the funeral home and I was there the first day she got there. I was there for 8 hours with her, and I sat in the room with her. It was just important for me that she not be alone. And they let me do that. Those are tender moments that are painful, but I'm also really grateful for those moments. And so that was in a way a ritual for me. And then sometimes it's a ritual, like the actual funeral is a ritual. Sometimes people have candle lightings or toy drives or kindness projects that they do as a ritual. And then what I saw in my research was, over time, people kind of expect grieving people to be better. Like, it's been 4 years. And so the rituals do tend to get more private because fewer and fewer people attend. And that's hurtful to parents. So if it's been 6 years and they invite a bunch of people out to their child's gravesite for birthday cake to remember their child on his 14th birthday, and only 3 people show up, that's really painful. And so they consciously or unconsciously start making it more private. And so those private rituals can be something like that at the cemetery, or they can be something like, a pilgrimage, a long hike, or I have a tattoo in my back that was done with my daughter's ashes. And so that to me was a very ritualistic thing. A good friend of mine, a beautiful man by the name of Dig, and I did this, and he held her ashes in his hand, and we meditated for a moment together. And I mean, it was quite profound. I mean, there were few words. In fact, I don't think there were any words. Both just sort of in tears, and it was really powerful. And so rituals can be anything. I work with a bereaved father, and every morning his 11-year-old son died, and every morning he would say to his son, "Good morning, son, I love you." And his son would respond, "Good morning, Dad, I love you." And that was their morning ritual for 11 years. Well, I guess as a baby, he probably didn't do it, but it was one way. And so when his son died, one of the painful things for him was, I don't get to say that to my son anymore and hear it back from him. And I said, yeah, that's true. You might not be able to hear it back from him, but can you say it?
Yeah, one of the nicer ones that Julia Samuel mentioned when I spoke to her was the idea of like maybe something like if your mum ever cooked a particular recipe, well, if you cook that again, you're, it's a ritual, it's a way of remembering your mum, but it's
Sure.
a way of actually bringing her sort of physically back into the world. And you sit down and eat this meal with your family, you're creating new memories with your family, happy memories based on the memory of your mother, and sort of honouring her at the same time. I thought that was quite a nice one. Before I forget, well, you were talking about this idea of confronting grief head on and delving into it, being in the grief. What do you think of the idea of people using metaphor in the event of death? Like, I kept saying on the last podcast, I kept saying that my dad had passed away, and then Julia said, "Can I pull you up on something? Your dad didn't pass away; he died." And she wasn't keen on the idea of using metaphor in language in that sense. And to be fair, I was only using the word pass away because I was trying to be sensitive to the listener. I'm quite comfortable with that word. But do you think using exacting language is a way of confronting grief properly?
I don't have I use whatever language the person wants to use, right? So I don't have an agenda with people. If I'm working with someone and they can't say that their child died, that's fine.
Right.
We'll say whatever they want. You want to say my child passed away? That's fine. We'll say that. I don't need to make anyone use the language that I might use for me. It's not about me. It's about that person.
Right. Okay. So tell us about this cellar care farm and how all this ties in, because I'm guessing it's maybe the culmination of all your research, all the findings that you've had, all the research and experience, I'm guessing to an extent go into this project. So
yes.
So what is it? How did it start, and what do you guys do there?
Okay, so what is it? It's a community where it's a therapeutic community, basically, and it's for grieving people to come and grieve and remember and connect, and it's so much bigger than that, really. So I guess to give you the essence, and anyone listening, the essence of what the Sella Care Farm is, I would have to tell you that I would have to give you its roots and where it began. So I had always wanted to hike a particular area. I'm an outdoorsy kind of girl, and I saw pictures of a beautiful place that was actually in northern Arizona, and I live in northern Arizona. But I'd never been to this place, and I'd seen pictures of it, and I was like, I'm going to hike there one day. And so a few years ago, for my 50th birthday, I got the opportunity to hike it. And I was preparing for like months. I was preparing. This is a hike I'd wanted to do for 40 years, right? And so we were going to camp down at the bottom. It's quite a hike. It's not an easy hike. And so it's in the Grand Canyon. And long story short, I went on this hike and was so excited. Took a selfie at the top with my backpack and my tent and my water. And I'm going on this hike. And then I was walking with my friend, and I noticed we had come around the first corner, maybe a minute or 2 minutes into the trail. And it's a descent first, and then the ascent is coming out. And I noticed down that there were pack horses, that they were carrying tourist gear way at the bottom. And I looked at my friend and I said, "Oh, you didn't tell me they use animals, horses, pack animals." And she said, "Oh yeah, they do." And I said, "Okay, like everybody's cool with the animals, right? Because I will freak my shit out. I'm a crazy animal lady. Like I don't mess around when it comes to animals and children. I'm very serious about life there." And she's like, "Oh no, yeah, it's great." And literally 10 seconds later, we came around the corner and a man was beating a horse on the trail. The horse was a pack horse. He had about 150 pounds on his back. And, I still, I still crack when I talk about it. It was really, I had never seen anyone beating an animal. And the animal had fallen, and his knees were bleeding and his head was bleeding, and the man was kicking and punching him, trying to get him up. And I screamed at him and I said, stop it, what are you doing?" And he said, the horse isn't hurt, he's lazy. And I said, he's bleeding. And long story short, I started to cry, like I'm crying now. And I had my friends take the packs off the horse. And underneath was a horror that I'd never seen. He was about 600 pounds underweight. His bone was actually worn through the skin, the bone of his back, his spine. His hip bones were worn through the skin. And he looked dead. You know, I looked in his vacant eyes, and I was sitting down with him. I had gone to pet him, actually, and he turned away like he thought I was going to hit him, and I just lost it. By this time, the man had taken the other 4 horses to the top and then left this horse here on the trail with us. And I just kept saying, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. And in that moment, you know, the horse looked at me and kind of leaned on me, and I was petting his head, just saying I was sorry over and over again. And he looked in my eyes, and I said, you know, to myself, he knows the same suffering that I knew when my child died. Like, I didn't want to live anymore. I didn't want to live. I didn't want to be here. I was hopeless, and I was afraid and lonely, and he was too. And people were walking by us on the trail, literally going like this because they didn't want to see it. And that's what people did to me. They didn't want to see my pain. And I thought, I'm not leaving him. If I leave him, it'll be like leaving myself. So I tried to buy him, and it was we were threatened, actually, physically threatened by his handler. So we left, and that was, you know, it was hard. That was one of the top 10 hardest things I've done in my life. Like leaving my dead child at the hospital, you know, hard. And I sobbed. And when I got home, it's a long story, but it took me 3 days. But I ended up being able to rescue him. And he, you know, no one thought he would live. He ended up in back surgery. He had a bone infection, and now is quite happy and chubby and well-loved. And he helps people who come here. And this is where the care farm comes in, because I had rescued him, and it had been about a week or 2 that I had him. And I work with a lot of Native people whose children have died. And one Native woman I worked with whose son died, we had been meeting, and he was, you know, we had a small corral for him in the backyard. And the Native woman I'd been meeting with, you know, talking about doing grief counseling, basically. She said, at the end of the session, she said, so, and this is a woman who wasn't prone to weeping. She would cry, she would get teary, but not, you know, effusively weeping. And she said, you know, that horse, because I posted it all over social media. And I said, yeah. And she said, could I spend some time with that horse? And I said, yeah, sure, of course. You know, do you want me with you? And she said, no. And I said, okay, yeah. So I put a bench out there, and she sat out there in the corral with him, and I left. And when I left and got back to my office, I could hear her wailing with him. Just wailing. And I thought, he's a better damn therapist than me. And I knew something really profound was happening. And that just kept happening with people over and over again, that they would want to go spend time with my horse. And I was like, okay. And they would be so emotionally open with him. And he didn't do anything. He stood there. He didn't give them Kleenex. He didn't tell them everything was going to be okay. He didn't run from them. He just stood with them. And I'm looking right now, and I'm looking at his pictures of my horse on the shelf. And, you know, and I just thought, he's incredible, you know, because he knows their suffering in a way. He knows not wanting to live anymore. And so do these people. These people know it, and they know that he knows it. And there's a connection there, like capital oneness. And so I started researching like horses and therapy. I mean, I knew people did therapy with horses. but it wasn't that. It was bigger than that. Like, it was bigger than putting a halter on a horse and making him follow you. That's not what was happening here. And I was trying to get my head around what's happening. There's some kind of a symbiotic exchange happening here in the moment. And so I came upon Rich Gorman's work, and he studied care farms in the UK. And I was like, oh, shit, what's this? And all the wonderful things they were doing for, like, in the restorative justice system. They used them primarily with, like, instead of halfway houses, they would go to care farms, and, people released from jail would go to care farms and work on care farms, and how they would connect with the animals and how meaningful it was. And I started reading Rich's research, and I was like, oh, well, I could start a care farm and I could rescue a bunch of animals. I mean, it totally aligns with who I am. I haven't eaten one since 72, for God's sake. And so I decided to start a vegan care farm where every single animal here has been rescued from abuse or neglect or torture. And they all have a story. And their stories are really profound for the people who come here. And I see people who come here and they don't even really like animals and connect with the animal, and it changes their lives and makes them more aware and more sensitive to the world around them, and starts to create that transformation that I can't really describe to you in words. All you can do is really see it, and something big and magical is happening. And so, we've been running day programs for 1.5 years, almost 2 years. And we now have 26 rescue animals. The day before yesterday, I just took in a baby donkey and her mom. We haven't named them yet. They're new. So Chamaco, my horse, is really the genius of the care farm. And he really loves people back into their bodies. It's pretty amazing.
Yeah. Danny the donkey would be a good name. Just throwing that out
there. I'll take it under consideration.
But what's interesting about that is when I first read about it, I was like, oh my God, it's such a good idea. It covers so many facets of a lot of the stuff that Johan talked about in Lost Connections, and a lot of these various different therapies that have been sort of cordoned off into their own, like, piecemeal theories. You've got this a sense of community. People are outdoors and they're working and they've got a sense of purpose, and you're breaking your routine, and it's people all together with a shared experience. And then you've got the animals there, which, like you said, they're like the ideal sort of therapist. There's no judgment there. You can talk to them. You can tell them whatever you want. And with the animals that have been through, the same sort of suffering that maybe you have, and it's just like, wow, it hits so many marks. How sort of successful is it proving? And again, steering clear of this idea of people going, oh, I'm grief-free.
Oh, better. But, the best thing that I can hope for is that they leave the farm feeling more connected, and that their grief has been seen and held. And that is almost always happening. And so I'm actually in the middle of a research study. So far, I have about 112, I think, participants, maybe actually more like 115 participants. And so the study will likely close sometime just before summer. And then I'll be extrapolating those data. And what I'm looking for is, because this is new in terms of putting all of these pieces. You're so astute to grasp this, sort of putting all of these pieces together in a place, in a proximal location, and letting people, in a sense, giving people some freedom. You like the dogs, you want to spend some time with the dogs, we'll spend some time with the dogs. You want to go down by the river and meditate, let's go down by the river and meditate. You want to do some yoga on the yoga deck, let's do some of that. You want to make a medallion for the medallion tree, let's do that. You want to stand here with this horse and cry, let's do that. And letting people sort of find for them the therapeutic effect, and letting them tell us then what was therapeutic for them so that we can hone what we're doing here and replicate it in other places, because everyone benefits then. People have actually left the care farm. In the study, one of the things that they've said is it's made me more aware of what I'm eating and made me more compassionate toward the earth, because we're sustainable. So we're on solar and we have our own well. And so we recycled, and we try to teach people in a passive way also about taking care of, all of our great mother, right? The Mother Earth, which is taking quite a beating from humankind as of recently. So it's really this holistic approach to, and it should be a holistic approach to this individual and collective grief.
So, I guess a good question to finish on, a positive question to finish on, I think, would be, even though we shouldn't necessarily do that,
I was waiting for you to correct yourself.
I keep getting told off by people that I interview to. I'm always like, I'm conscious that we're ending on a negative note. And I got told off by a guy called William Epstein. I'll always remember it. It was the first time. And he said, we should be ending on a negative note because that's the way things are on the particular topic we were talking about. And I need to remember that. But I think this is a positive question. I believe that you, after losing your daughter, you went on to have another child. How do you... I mean, that for me is the ultimate message or sign that this can be again, not overcome, but that it doesn't have to be the end of everything. That you can go on, you can, you can go on living again, and you can be happy again. But you can start again. It doesn't need to be the end of everything, like the way I maybe painted it out at the beginning, which is what I think, the way I think I deal with it. And how did you get there?
Oh, gosh. So before I answer that, I have to acknowledge that it is the end of everything. Okay. I mean, I really need to say that. Not only for me, but for anyone who's listening to this, perhaps who's lost a child who couldn't have another one for whatever reason, age or infertility or by personal choice or even fear. And that's understandable, right?
Yep.
So Josh was born 3 years after she died. And he didn't make it easier, and he didn't make it better, and he certainly didn't make me more happy. It was Josh. And I love Josh, just like I love my other 3 children. And yet he's number 5. He's not number 4. Number 4 is still missing. Yeah. And I will also say that I probably was a much better parent to him, even if slightly more overprotective. I was probably more present. I was probably more patient. I don't think I was more loving, because I was already sort of a overly doting, loving mother, or more nurturing, I guess I should say. I was already really nurturing. I was the woman who breastfed for 2.5 years, all of her children. So I don't think that it was that. I think that it was that I was more patient and more tolerant and more aware that I could actually lose him at any point.
Yeah.
And the fragility, realizing the fragility of life, made me appreciate, not in a trite and cliche way, but in a very, very serious way. This is all I have right now, for sure. You better make it count. And that's big.
Okay, final question. So we have well and truly kicked the shit out of the concept of happiness during the course of this conversation. So instead of happiness, Joanne, what should we be striving for, if anything?
Well, to me, happiness is 2 things. To me, happiness is serving others. To me, happiness is living our lives, not just for ourselves. Even if it's in small ways. And I don't mean you have to start a big foundation and do these, you don't have to be Mother Teresa or Gandhi. But I mean, just looking for opportunities to help someone, open a door for someone. I mean, serving, really seeing people, seeing deeply, and maybe not just people. From my perspective, maybe also animals. Rescue an animal, for God's sake. Rescue an animal. Save a life when you can. Do something to serve another being, please. For me, it was the only way I could make good use of my pain. I don't want my pain. I would rather have my child here than my pain. But here I am with this pain. So why not make good use of it? And then the other piece of happiness that stands next to service is what I call contentment. And contentment means being content with what is. I practice yoga, and real yoga. What real yoga is about being with what is without needing to change it, unifying everything without needing to change it. And so some days when I'm griefy and I wake up and I'm like, this is bullshit. I didn't sign up for this. I don't want this. And I'm angry and pissy and I want to just go crawl under my sheets and have a good cry. I do. I'll go crawl under my sheets and have a good cry. I let it be what it is. And I'm content with that. And then there are days when I see a sunrise and I'm feeling so connected to everything. And, in a way I can see the beauty of her being, my dead child's being. And it may come with sadness, but bigger than the sadness is the love. And I may even feel joy and intense happiness. And I'm okay with that too. I'm content with that too. I am content with whatever this moment brings for me emotionally, even when it's hard. And that is real happiness, because you can't be happy if all you're doing is seeking happiness, because that's the antithesis of happiness, because you're miserable trying to find it. And you can't be happy if you always pretend to be happy. No one's happy all the time. Period. No one is.
Okay, Joanne. Well, now would be a good time to, I suppose, especially with the first thing you said with, finding purpose and connecting with other people. If you'd like to take this opportunity now to maybe share some links with people, any resources you'd recommend, sure. And also a shameless plug for social media and things like that. Don't be shy.
Okay. Well, if you're interested in what we're doing on the Care Farm, our website is sellacarefarm.com, SELAH, sellacarefarm.com. If you have lost a child and you're looking for support, please find any one of these organizations. The organization that I founded is the MISS Foundation, and it's missfoundation.org. There's another wonderful organization called Parents of Murdered Children, and you can Google, I think it's POMC.org. There's the Compassionate Friends, another organization for parents whose children have died. And I think it's compassionatefriends.org. Let's see, what other good resources? If you're looking for my book, you can get it on Amazon. It's $10. It's helped a lot of people. It's Bearing the Unbearable, Love, Loss, and the Heartbreaking Path of Grief. It's written in very, very short chapters because grief brain is a real thing. And so the chapters are like 2 or 3 pages. And I've had many people who weren't even bereaved actually read the book. Why, I'm not sure. But they said that it changed their lives, which is brave. I mean, it's brave for someone who's never lost anyone they love in, catastrophic grief experience to read that book, because it's a lot of stories of people who have lost parents and children and partners and siblings. It's a hard thing to read, but meaningful too. So those are a few resources. Please be in touch with someone. Get support somewhere.
Okay, and again, don't be afraid to social media. Shameless plug.
Yeah. I have a Twitter, Dr._Cacciatore, and I have a Facebook page, just Dr. Joanne Cacciatore. I think it's a pretty well-visited Facebook page. Lots of really helpful things there. I do a lot of psychoeducation from my Facebook page. And let's see, the MISS Foundation also has both. And then the Instagram, we have the Sella Care Farm has an Instagram page. So if you're interested, you can meet our new donkey, who we'll be naming soon, and her little baby girl. They're so cute. And you can meet some of our animals there too.
Okay, well, as always, I will include links to all those in the show notes, including especially the Instagram page where you'll be able to go see Danny the donkey. So, Joanne Cacciatore or Cacciatore, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you, Danny. Thank you for having this conversation. It was brave.